Is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on the outs? This is a question many around the world are wondering as Israel enters week 4 of its war against Hamas. Now, Vox correspondent Zack Beauchamp writes that typically during war, people rally around their government, but in Israel, there's a growing push to dump the prime minister, one with an outside chance of succeeding. A now deleted tweet from the Israeli prime minister in which he criticized the Israeli military and security services during wartime has been labeled psychotic and bizarre, according to Israeli newspaper Haaretz. Since the beginning of the war last month, Netanyahu and his family have been trying to lay the blame on the Israeli Defense Forces.
Amnon Shasua, who is the CEO of self-driving car company Mobileye, which is headquartered in Jerusalem, has called for Netanyahu's ouster and says his government has been guilty of failures, dissonance, and incompetence. Protesting has taken place in Tel Aviv, demanding Netanyahu do a prisoner swap instead of prosecuting the military offensive in the manner he has declared. Many claim Netanyahu has abandoned the hostages to achieve his war aims. Joining us now to weigh in is senior correspondent at Vox, Zack Beauchamp. Welcome, Zack.
Hey, happy to be here with y'all.
All right, now, how serious is the threat to Netanyahu? When this conflict emerged, as I understand it, they instituted a coalition government, which I felt like offered him some protection to pursue this war the way he saw fit. But as we pointed out earlier in this read, he has been facing a great degree of frustration from the public who feel like he is not prioritizing the release of hostages, and many people who blame him for the security failure on October 7th to begin with. So what's the lay of the land?
So we have to differentiate between two different coalitional arrangements. It's really important to understand just as background to get it, right? So before the war, there's 120 seats in Israel's Knesset, right? Its parliament. Right before the war, Netanyahu had 64 of those 120 seats in his coalition. There are lots of different parties in the Israeli system. His Likud party only has 32 seats. So 32. His Likud party only has 32 seats. So I'm sorry. Are we doing this edited or is it going to be just fully recorded? I just blanked for a second on it.
We can start over your response if you want to, but we try to keep live.
Yeah, okay. I'll cut from the beginning.
Is that okay, production room? Okay.
Okay. So it's important, I think, to distinguish between two different components of Netanyahu's political coalition. So the 120 seats in Israel's Knesset has a bunch of smaller parties. His Likud party does not have a majority on its own. Before the war, he had 64 seats in his coalition. Now, after the war, one of the main opposition parties joined in an emergency cabinet agreement, right? So in order for his coalition government to survive, it doesn't need the emergency coalition, right? Because they'd vote against him under the circumstances they could be toppled. This is just for the purposes of prosecuting the war. He needs to lose 5 seats among the parties that supported him before the war. So it's a pretty tall order, right? Because those parties tend to be much more ideologically aligned with him. That being said, the fact that there's growing discontent, you can see one in a Haaretz article where members of his own party were starting to talk about the need for him to go afterwards. Right, and his poll numbers are disastrous to show his party losing about 40% of its seats if they were to go to elections sometime soon, indicates that it's not impossible to imagine a scenario under which internal discontent, even among his supporters, grows high enough that there's a move to push him out with a vote that would replace him in the parliament.
You know, we live in a more polarized time, certainly in the U.S., but there's evidence of that in a lot of other, Western countries. I remember, some speculation when COVID happened that, well, maybe that will boost Trump's approval rating. It actually, if anything, accelerated his unpopularity because there's not this kind of rally around the person in a times of crisis is tempered a bit by, I think, just how much we vocally disagree. Is that the same case in Israel to some extent?
Oh, yeah. Israel was hugely polarized prior to the war, right? So this really all started with Netanyahu getting indicted on corruption charges, right? Very, very serious charges related to, among other things, tampering with the freedom of the Israeli press. And so Netanyahu is indicted. He's currently on trial right now, though I don't think the trial is proceeding during the war. And that basically led to a political crisis in Israel, where the country was divided evenly between people who wanted Netanyahu to stay in office and his bitter opponents. And so it led to something like 4 or 5 elections in a very, very short number of years, right? And eventually, after all of this political turmoil, right, he ends up losing power in 2021. He's out for a year, and then he comes back in 2022 on this very, very, very narrow coalition that represents basically the extreme right of Israeli society on the whole, right? And it means his Likud party, which is mostly a vehicle for his own ambitions, the radical right settler faction, religious Zionism, and 2 ultra-Orthodox parties, which primarily care about the interests of their own community. But they were polarized against the center and the left of Israeli society, who believes Netanyahu is an existential threat to Israeli democracy. And matters got a lot worse when earlier in 2023, he tried to push through an overhaul to Israel's court system, right? And this overhaul basically would have brought the courts under political control, really, really, really freaked out most Israelis. It was widely unpopular, right? And it had already led to him taking a major political hit. I mean, we're talking it's spawning the largest political protest movement in Israel's history, right? It went on for months and months and months of street protests, sometimes paralyzing major cities, right? This is a huge deal. And then you layer on top of that the worst security failure in Israel's history, right? The October 7th attack, I mean, and substantial evidence that he's personally responsible for it. And all of a sudden, right, the polarized logjam almost breaks. Right? People are really angry with Netanyahu, including people who had voted for him in 4 or 5 elections. Right? He doesn't have much. There's not much room for him to improve his political situation from beforehand, because the people who hate him even more. Really, it's likely, unless the war goes super well and looks really, really easy for Israel, which I seriously doubt it won't, that he'll be able to do much to improve his political standing.
Yeah, it's been just reported that I think at this point 12 or 13 members of the IDF have been killed in the ground invasion near Gaza City. When you read their ages, they're all 19, 20, 21. I do wonder if the death toll starts to go up among Israeli soldiers as they move into a more ground war, as opposed to the bombing, the cost of which has been borne disproportionately by Palestinian civilians, that will continue to affect his popularity. I did want to ask you, though, about his perception internationally. I've read a number of reports about how basically every living American president has found him to be personally very difficult, if not distasteful. And I recently spoke to Mark Lamont Hill, who's a scholar in this area on the region, who talked a lot about how what he says addressing his home audience versus what he says in English, what he says in Hebrew versus the speeches he makes in English, are often very different, with these Hebrew statements being somewhat more reactionary, alarmist, dare I say, authoritarian. One clip in particular has been going viral over the last couple of days, in which he quotes Deuteronomy, the New Testament, to say, we need to utterly destroy all that Amalek have and spare them not, but to slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. People have been taking this as people who understand and know the Bible well have taken this as a genocidal statement and an inducement to kill everybody and spare none. What do you make about how his kind of visibility on the international stage has affected the support that he perhaps has in the United States and more broadly?
Well, so I have a somewhat different interpretation of that Amalek quote than the one that you offered. So it's often used, Amalek is a biblical figure that represents a sort of existential threat to the Jewish people. It's often used just as a code word for an enemy among Jews, right? So you've heard Hitler referred to as Amalek. Haman, the villain of the Purim story, who tried to slaughter all the Jews in Persia at the time, also referred to as Amalek, right? So it's not that, just using that term and the reference and the way that he made it does not strike me, based on, the way that I hear other Jews talk about it, as necessarily a genocidal statement. What I will say, sort of about his rhetoric in general is that he's trying to appeal, often in Hebrew, to a very, very particular and very extreme base. And I think your label of authoritarian is accurate, right? Netanyahu really, really is, I think at this point, unquestionably an authoritarian figure. The problem is that he's faced a society that's realized it. And so he's trying to figure out, really desperately scrambling to secure his own political position and to stay out of jail. Like, those are his primary objectives. And so a lot of the criticism inside Israel has oriented around his confusion of the state with his own personal well-being and welfare. And that's, I mean, it's hard to deny that claim if you look at what he's done and you look at the way that he's talked, right? You guys referenced that deleted tweet earlier, right? No responsible leader during wartime says, oh, it's all the military's fault. I don't have anything to do with it. It's not my problem, right? I wasn't warned of any of the security failures, right? Throwing your generals under the bus like that and not claiming responsibility, it's just not what anyone expects of their political leadership during this time. And it's indicative of a broader way of thinking about this that is all filtered through the lens of his political and arguably physical survival. So that's, I would read everything that Netanyahu does through the lens of what is he doing to secure his political future. And I think that's very, very dangerous in the context. I mean, that's putting it mildly, right? In the context of a really bloody war.
Zack Beauchamp, thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot.